This is Joanne Robinson, head of the Women's Political Council. You want to read a great book on the Montgomery bus boycott? Hers. The Montgomery bus boycott and the women who made it. This is E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter and head of the NAACP in Montgomery, and Rosa Parks' boss. These guys knew that, particularly after Brown v. Board, that the segregation ordinance on the buses was vulnerable to court challenge. There, in fact, had a year or two before been a successful bus boycott in Louisiana. Remember, it was in Shreveport, Baton Rouge? Baton Rouge. They were looking for a test case. In fact, they found one. A black woman named Claudette Colvin. You don't need to remember these names, although it might be interesting to try.
She was 14.
Yep. Who was a teenager who refused to give up her seat. And they thought that they would bring a case, and then they realized that she was pregnant out of wedlock. And they reckoned that whoever their figurehead for the case was going to become pretty famous. And so they didn't want to proceed under those circumstances. Little could they have imagined.
More strong thermals, but
No, this is the stuff, we gotta be careful. Gotta be careful. But that case, again, a recognition that you were projecting publicly to a watching public in America that was increasingly coming to see black-white relations in the South not simply as the South's business, which had been the position the nation had essentially taken since the collapse of Reconstruction, but as an affront to the nation's values. The other thing about Rosa Parks had been to a leadership training institute at Highlander Folk School. This is a place we should remember. It was in Monteagle, Tennessee. Its founder or co-founder was a Southern socialist theologian named Miles Horton. He was a union organizer. And in the 1930s, he created this center in Tennessee, in Appalachia, that was designed both to preserve Appalachian culture and to provide training for union organizers who were trying to organize workers, particularly in the coal fields. One of the things that they did at Highlander was they emphasized local music. And the prevalence of music in the civil rights movement reflects the imprint of Highlander. One of their songs, a union organizing song from the 30s and 40s, was "We Will Overcome." Changed the words a little bit, became "We Shall Overcome," and you have an anthem. Rosa Parks, in one of her, I don't know if this is a memoir or an interview, talked about staying at Highlander Folk School at this weekend leadership training thing. This was long before the Montgomery bus boycott. Right? Long before she decided that the time had come to make a test case. Right? And waking up and smelling coffee and bacon. And realizing that she wasn't the one making it. That somebody was making it for her. And that person was white. And that had never happened to her in her life. A number of times she had served food to white people. And no white person had ever served food to her. That's Martin Luther King and Miles Horton at a communist training school, the Highlander Folk School, which the state of Tennessee shut down in 1961, though Horton managed to relocate it and reopen it. Here you see the bus boycott. A lot of people walked, organized carpools. These carpools, they're constantly pulled over for driving too fast, driving too slow, and so forth. But the Montgomery bus boycott attracted the attention of the nation. So we're talking 10 years after the end of World War II. And now you have a black person represented on a national magazine, not looking like some kind of minstrel buffoon, looking like this. This is the process in the prehistory, if you will, of the civil rights movement that I'm trying to get at here. In the sense, I'm sure a lot of Southern readers of Time magazine canceled their subscription. Again, this growing sense among Northerners who, let it be said, have lots of stereotypes about white Southerners as a bunch of ignorant, reactionary, backward hillbillies, increasingly looking with shock and revulsion at a Southern labor. The end of the boycott. I read an article somewhere, I couldn't find it the other night, about that guy. That guy was just taking the bus to work. And it was the day after finally a Supreme Court decision had come and the boycotters after nearly a year had won. And Rosa Parks boards the bus. And the entire news media in the world is there photographing her. This guy ends up being like, in history, just like going to work. This begins really then, if you will, the kind of canonical or the most famous series of episodes in the history of the Civil Rights Movement. This is 1957, the integration of Little Rock High School, when after Governor Orwell Faubus had called out the National Guard to prevent 7 black students from enrolling at the school, Eisenhower actually nationalized the Guard and called in the 101st Airborne. And here you see something of the temper of the place in this haunting picture of one of the girls and one of her classmates. And there's actually a book by an author who found those 2 women and brought them together for kind of reflective discussion on their lives. Remember the title. 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. A group of students at North Carolina A&T sitting in at the lunch counter of the local Walmart. I'll return to that. 1961, the Freedom Rides, testing recent court orders that had barred racial discrimination in interstate buses. And in Birmingham, Alabama, Anniston, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, the mobs, with the Klan mobs, essentially abetted by the police, set upon Freedom Riders. They eventually came to Jackson. The Kennedy administration cut a deal with Ross Barnett that as long as he ensured that they didn't get beat up, because Kennedy was no fan of the Freedom Riders, nor for that matter was King. Kennedy was about to go to Vienna to negotiate with Khrushchev. And the last thing, and Khrushchev's loving the fact that as this meeting's about to happen, everything on TV is about these white mobs beating, black and white Freedom Riders with lead pipes. His thing is, we need a cooling off period, get them off the buses, get them off the buses, get them off the buses. What he does in the case of Jackson is negotiates a secret deal with Governor Barnett not to beat him, but to take him off to Parchment. Most of them spent 40 days at Parchment. 62, the integration of Ole Miss by James Meredith. We'll get back to that. 63, some of the really iconic photos, Bull Connor's police dogs setting on protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. Children subjected to fire hoses. If that's the sort of canonical story of civil rights, I now want to turn the time I have left, and I don't have much time, to start talking about Mississippi. And I want to, because Mississippi was different. Mississippi was not what we just saw. I guess the Ole Miss demonstration, the riot that happened in Ole Miss with the integration of the University by James Meredith would count. But what was remarkable about Mississippi was not large-scale demonstrations in public space led by charismatic leaders who would come into a town, sweep in, mobilize people for demonstrations or boycott or whatever, and then move on. But it was a different kind of tradition, what people called an organizing tradition. And the most important figure in that was a woman named Ella Baker. And we're going to hear this name a lot. And while I don't think you need to remember all of the names I'm bombarding you with today. I hope you'll remember this. People who were in the Mississippi movement will tell you this was the most influential person in the history of their movement, although Miss Baker herself would be horrified if somebody said that. She was born in 1903 in North Carolina. She worked for a time as a journalist in New York, got involved in a cooperative movement there. In the late 1930s, went to work for the NAACP. You know about this a bit. Continued to work for the NAACP in the 40s and early 50s, but did it a little differently. She wasn't working on the legal cases with the Legal Defense Fund. She was director of branches. And what that meant was that she was traveling around southern states, trying to sustain these small little local branches of the NAACP that black people, many of them returning servicemen, had created. And we're talking about a time in the state of Mississippi where having an NAACP card on your person would get you killed. One of the people I hope we get to meet, not from Macomb, he's from Summit, a man named Hollis Watkins. I hope to be able to show you a picture or two of him in a moment. Told me this amazing story. Hollis was, I think, the youngest of 12 or 14 kids, just on the border of Lincoln County. And being out plowing with his dad one day, and something happened with the plow, and they were bending over, he was about 14, to fix it. And his dad's wallet fell out of the top pocket of his overall. When Hollis picked it up, there was an NAACP membership. And he handed it back to his father, he looked at his father, and his father looked at him, and neither of them said a word. Well, that was a man who had taken his life in his hands to people. Edgar Evers, the person we're going to meet, Amesy Moore. I'll show you some pictures of this. Ella was incredibly frustrated with the NAACP. To her, this was the movement. You didn't create strong people by teaching them to follow leaders. You tried to build those resources that were in the community. Strong people don't need strong leaders. The media will make a leader, that means the media can break a leader. What you want, if you believe, and she was radical, in a participatory democratic society, is a movement that will embody those values. And she was getting nowhere in the NAACP. These branches, these courageous people, who would not even meet publicly because they were afraid, but who would sometimes try to communicate. She would go off and see them, and she couldn't get anybody in New York to care about that. They were too busy meeting with senators and arguing before the Supreme Court. Eventually she left, and she became the executive secretary, because she was a woman, I think she was only the temporary executive secretary, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's organization that had grown out of the Montgomery bus boycott. But her frustration there continued. It was all about Martin. I said to you a moment ago, Martin didn't make the movement made Martin. That's a quotation from Ella Baker. Well, in 1960, I'm not sure what slide I got next. In 1960, Ella Baker persuaded King's SCLC to give her $500 to host a conference at her alma mater, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And the idea was to create a coordinating committee for the sit-ins. That sit-in I showed you in Greensboro, North Carolina. Those sit-ins had spread all over the country, certainly all over the South. Those 4 people who sat down in Greensboro, by the end of the week, there were 20, 30, 40 people there, and national press. By the end of the month, there were sit-ins taking place in more than 200 cities in the South. Mostly cities that had black colleges. for the first time, scope for young black people to insert themselves in the movement. Ella's idea was that you could bring these people together so they should know about each other. They should know who each other is. They should learn about tactics, what's worked elsewhere, and so forth. They should coordinate.